When I first found out that Baldur's Gate 3 was going to be done by Alverin Studios, the creators of one of the best RPGs of this past decade in my opinion, that being Divinity Original Sin 2, I was elated. What they captured in DOS 2 was a particularly powerful gameplay concept that I like to call adventurism. Adventurism is the idea that there are problems in this game, and there are a lot of ways to solve those problems. On top of that, those problems are intertwined, and the order in which you solve those problems drastically changes how you will solve the next problems that arise. Kind of like having 3 puzzles that are all tied together. Each puzzle has 3 ways to solve it. Solving one puzzle changes the other 2 puzzles, though there are 3 new ways to solve those puzzles once you've solved the first one, based on how you solved the first one. Kind of creates this exponential experience whenever you're looking at them from a meta view, and for replayability as well. More importantly, DOS 2 did this with combat and the problems you encountered in the world, specifically exploration, and even mixed those 2 things together. Take, for example, the difference between casting an earth spell to slick the ground and slow your opponents before they reach you, which also makes it harder for you to reach them, versus sending out a fireball that burns those who are hit and ignites any flammable surfaces. Baldur's Gate had a similar experience due to the nature of the game, for example, sending out a web spell versus a fireball, but it lacked adventurism in the exploration department. For the most part, in Baldur's Gate, you walked around talking to people until you ran into a problem. Very rarely, if ever, was there actual environmental problem in Baldur's Gate. Whereas in DOS 2, some spots are dangerous to walk due to poison. You can set those spots ablaze though. Or hellfire plagues the ground, and you have to get your holy juice and douse them. Or there's a maze with intricate locks that require special keys, but you can kind of just teleport through them with special abilities. Baldur's Gate really only had traps, where you either saw them and disarmed them, or you didn't and got kicked in the dick. However, something Baldur's Gate did have that made up for this lack of gameplay depth was its aesthetic. Now, what do I mean by aesthetic? Aesthetic is the lens through which you experience a game, media, or otherwise piece of art. It's the way you experience it. A big part of aesthetic is the art style. We could sit down and go over each intricate difference between Sandro Botticelli's Punishment of the Sons of Korra and Francisco Goya's Blue Ruins, but it's safe to say one is more bright, textured, and grounded, while the other is dark, mystical, and surreal. In both paintings, you'll ask yourself, what's going on here? But you'll expect to interpret the answers differently. For example, in Botticelli's work, you'll want a practical answer. Why are these guys on the ground? What pushed them onto the ground? Why are they so afraid? What are they afraid of? However, in Goya's, you'll be looking for more abstract answers. What is this supposed to be a metaphor for? What does it mean? Who do these people represent? And the fact that you ask yourself those questions proves the aesthetic difference alone is important to your interaction with the work. Aesthetic isn't just art style though. Aesthetic can be sounds made whenever clicking through a UI, story elements contained within the game, or moral decisions your character is forced to make. All of these things and more can add or subtract from the aesthetic you're trying to convey to your audience. There's a big difference between how you're interpreting your actions in Final Fantasy when you're chopping up a mecha robot with a sword twice your size and fireworks with the accent to every swing, than when you land on someone in Dishonored and plunge a dagger straight through their throat. Ask any filmographer, even down to the colors we use when filming, the entire lens through which stories are told changes. So now that we know aesthetic is artistic style, what the art represents, the sounds, and the narrative tone, let's compare Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 3. Let's start with Baldur's Gate's UI. A stony background and buttons that are slightly cracked and worn. Whenever you press them, you get the satisfying grinding stone click sound. Whenever you hover over something you want more information on, a scroll opens up to label it, accompanied by a sound that depicts that as well. Whenever you rummage around in your inventory, open up your map, your spell book, or pick up a scroll, we have indicators that consistently put you in the driver's seat. You really feel like you're rummaging around in your backpack. You really feel like you're picking up a potion and giving it to your friend. And this was intentional. There was a design meeting about this. Do you know how I know? Because whenever you give an order to an NPC party member in the game, it takes anywhere from 0 to half a second for them to act on it. Now ask yourself, why is that? Why is there a random amount of time between when I, the player, give an order to a character in my party to do something? Go ahead, pause the video, take a guess. Here's the answer. It's because you're not giving the order. Your character is, and he has to say something. That's why when you click on a character in the game and give them an order, they respond. You're not God in this game. You're whatever character you made. See, because verisimilitude, reality, was a very important cornerstone to this game's aesthetic. And that's what made it so visceral. See, because the further you step away from reality, the more detached you become to any concept associated with the work. It's harder for you to personalize it. Baldur's Gate was a fantasy game, with potions, spells, and creatures that were from another world entirely. But everything was presented enough like our world to make it seem real. So when you killed someone in their home and they screamed their last breath, it had weight to it. Whenever you lost a party member and another party member commented on it, you could feel it. You weren't a player who just lost a character to the game. You were an adventurer who just lost a friend to the world. And you felt that way because of the art, the sounds, and the characters. All of these things were very believable. But how do we make these things believable? And where does the departure occur? And why do we tend to depart if we know we can give the players a more visceral experience by keeping the world grounded? Let's take a look at a very traditional creature in fantasy. The Goblin. In first edition, this is what goblins looked like. This is the depiction we had. Eventually, they looked like this in second edition, and then this in third edition. Now look closely at this goblin, and try to understand why the artist depicted them this way. They're almost simian, which is familiar to us. It's realistic. Their faces are flat and ugly. They're proportionate in size and bone structure. It looks real. Look at what he's wearing, what he's holding. It's shamshack, thrown together and tribal. In short, he looks grimy. He looks rustic. He looks like something you might actually find in your backyard one day, pillaging your tomatoes. Now let's look at what happened in 4th edition. Can you spot the difference? They're a lot cleaner. Their weapons and armor are disproportionate or unrealistic in size and design. For some reason, they look more cartoonish. These are the goblins of Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate doesn't have any goblins, but it has gibberlings, and this is what they look like. What Baldur's Gate does have that Baldur's Gate 3 also has is the warg. Wargs are supposed to be larger, more intelligent, and explicitly evil canines that wander the realms looking to cause harm to do-gooders. In Baldur's Gate, this is what they looked like. Pretty standard. Almost impossible to tell them from another wolf. However, in Baldur's Gate 3, this is what they look like. Quite a stark contrast. In Baldur's Gate 3, they're obviously modeled off of our new depiction for wargs that we get from the source books for 5th edition. 4th edition made a departure from the gritty realism of 3rd by making their monsters look almost like World of Warcraft characters, presumably in an attempt to keep up with the changing tastes of the younger generation. 5th edition tried to keep that appeal while also trying to make it just gritty enough to appeal to people who fell in love with Baldur's Gate, 2nd edition, and 3rd edition's art styles. My point, however, is that there is a distinct difference between being killed by a slightly bigger dog with different colored coat and a wolf with a boomerang back. And it's not just the way the monsters look either. It's the way the combat looks too. Let's take a look at critical hits. In Baldur's Gate, whenever you get a critical hit on a creature, it's not unlike any other hit except that it deals more damage. That's about it. If you deal a certain amount of damage to put them under a hit point threshold of the negatives, i.e. they have 3 hit points left and you hit them for 37 damage, they will explode into a meaty chunk of gore. Presumably to represent the devastating amount of damage you did to them. Now, hitting someone in real life with a sword doesn't turn them into a messy gore of chunks like it does in Baldur's Gate, so we know that this is an intentional design choice that says something about how the game is trying to portray itself. Contrast this meaty explosion, again, only whenever you do an incredible amount of damage to a creature, with a missed arrow shot in Baldur's Gate 3. Now we must ask ourselves, why is it in Baldur's Gate whenever someone is hit with an arrow, their character recoils and there's a small amount of blood that spurts from them? But in Baldur's Gate 3, even missing causes a flash of light to appear around the character, as if the arrow was moving so fast that it ignited the air around the character as they dodged it, or it broke the light barrier or something. I mean, Baldur's Gate has effects similar to this flash of light, as we can see with their spells. Surely if they wanted, they could have illustrated some flicker whenever you missed a bow shot. But they didn't. Why? Because in Baldur's Gate, the designers of the game wanted magic to remain special. They wanted mundane to be mundane. And above all else, it doesn't make any sense. Why would it make sense for there to be a flash of light next to your character whenever they dodged an arrow shot? I might understand a small flicker of light on clashing metal, but the mere use of a bow necessitates a spark and a flash for the viewer. Why? Well, the answer given by lead designer of Baldurs Gate III and founder of Alverin Studios, Sven Vink, was, and I quote, "We actually started with a more mundane version but it didn't work that well and made it harder to read, which is why to give it some extra flash." This is what the real argument comes down to. This is, at the crux, what all of these threads, all of these Reddit posts, and comments and everything, this is what people are arguing about when they say this game is too much of a departure from Baldur's Gate. This is why it looks too much like Divinity, or it's a Divinity clone. It has nothing to do with Divinity. It has nothing to do with the title. It has nothing to do with dark writing elements or there being lots of blood and gore. It has to do with aesthetic. And even really small things like lights when your sword collides with a meaty creature, or the UI looking like a space station overlay can fuck up your aesthetic. The real argument is, can you live without a flashy light when you mess with your bow? According to Sven, he made the executive decision that we couldn't, and honestly, maybe he knows something we don't. But when I played Baldur's Gate for the first time, I didn't know when I missed, because there was no sound telling me so. But guess what? I knew when I hit, and when I got hit, because this is what it sounded like. This is what it looked like, and I felt it, because in real life, whenever I stub my toe, that's what it sounds like to me in my head. That's what it feels like to me in my body. That's what it looks like. It's not flashy. There's no damage sign floating off the top of my head, and to be honest, there's no blood bar filling up my portrait either, but you know what? It kind of feels like there is. And that's what aesthetic is. It's how all these elements come together to make you feel when you play the game. And Baldur's Gate 3 feels too much like a JRPG, too much like World of Warcraft, and not enough like an adventuring party walking through Faerun, rationing their resources and scraping by to survive, regardless of if that's what you're actually doing in the game or not. Because it doesn't look that way. It looks too clean, too bright, too polished. The characters are spotless despite walking around outside in complete mayhem. The goblins who are suited for war don't even have a scratch on them. And what really sucks here is the truth. This is worth discussing for another game, but not for this one, because it's too late. This is what the game looks like. The game's going to get a graphical overhaul at some point, but the entire art style is not going to change. The aesthetic was decided when the modelers and the artists at hand put their figurative brushes to the canvas. This is how it is. What we can ask of the team is a better UI that's hopefully a new take on the old idea that Baldur's Gate had with the moving stone buttons and scrolls. We can ask that the creators trust us to recognize what's going on in a fight without needlessly adding flashes and swooshing air to mundane physical attacks. But honestly, I don't know how much of a difference those things would even make, and how the game feels whenever you play it. It might push us 30% closer to what we wanted. And since the revenue was already spent on animating those swooshes, beams of light, and slicing sparks, I don't know if Larian actually has the conscience to just delete that work and remove it from the game. That's a hard thing to do, to destroy your own work, but a lot of artists know sometimes that's the best thing to do. It's a struggle. Here, I think that'd be the best thing to do. And it's not like Baldur's Gate didn't have flashiness or didn't go over the top, but when it did, it made sense. Magic Missile was magical. It was supposed to be flashy. And whenever you used magic, you really felt like you were using magic because that's the only time you saw that flash or heard those sounds or saw those colors in such a muted world. I mean, with all this being said, I know the game's going to be fun. I have little hopes that it'll compare to Baldur's Gate in terms of artistic styling or aesthetic or writing, especially considering Sven has repeatedly said that every good story has a beginning, middle, and end, and I vehemently disagree with that. That's a conversation for another video. In the meantime, let's cross our fingers and hope we have fun with the $60 early access title.